Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Joint Rules Committee meeting, and it is November 30th, 2021. Today, we are going to be talking about different policies and updates to help us reopen in January in the most safest way possible. We are going to start this morning with continuing the conversation around live streaming and record retention. For committee members and those following along on our website for joint rules, you'll see our decision chart. This is number 16 on that chart. And also the updated draft policy is available there. Based on our conversation at our last meeting, there was a request to get more information from our state archivist, and so we have her here to join us. We'll also hear testimony from CCTV and from the clerk of the House. Just a reminder for everyone, our goal with this is to have consensus with this committee at Joint Rules for a policy, and then it will be then the Senate Rules and the House Rules Committee that takes the final votes on these. So looking for consensus, and then we'll let the two Rules Committee move forward from there. Our goal is to have the same policy for the whole building to keep it simple and understandable for everyone. So with that, let's start with the draft policies and best practices for committee and session live streaming and records. Tanya Marshall, come up. Thank you for being able to join us today.
For having me. I did provide written testimony as well, and I guess again, if the committee would like to just see what the digital archives looks like, and I can do that through Zoom when you're ready. But for the record, I'm Tanya Marshall. I'm the State Archivist and Chief Records Officer. I'm also the Director of the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. So if you're not familiar with us, we're called the SARA. We are a division of the Secretary of State's office. We oversee the statewide records and information management program, and part of those services include being the official repository for permanent records in the state, and that is all through the state government. In terms of legislative records, we go back to before pre-statehood. Legislative records are most commonly research records from state archives. With the exception of the last biennium, in terms of the YouTube videos, those are the only things that have not yet been transferred from the closure of the last session. We do provide access on a regular basis. We have become the kind of the clearinghouse in terms of committee records for that. And then since the 2015-2016 biennium, we have been receiving the records in digital format directly from the legislature. And that has been going into our digital archives. And so for background on the digital archives, it's called BT Retain. It is a system that we developed in concert with about 9 other states through a federally funded program that included the Vermont legislature. Is to bring a system on board that does digital preservation in addition to long-term access. And so the digital preservation piece is that if you can think about the paper in front of you, you can pull a paper from 1700 and still look and read it. Digital records obviously become very technical, obsolescent quickly. So the system is actually designed to capture the record, preserve it so that we know that it came intact to us. And then the system also pools the file formats for about 2,000 different file types over time. So if you think about the first word processing program that you ever use, like Paris works, we have some words that are still on state servers. It has preserved that code so that we can still access it. And then what we can do is render it in a way that humans can still read it with different technology. So it does this digital preservation piece, and then it also does the public access piece. So something that's not exempt from public inspection or copying underneath the Public Records Act, that is then available publicly online. And so that's how majority of people do research right now for the digital archives.
Great. Does anyone have any questions about that before we get a little test run or test drive or some visual aids of what this looks like? I think we heard this last time, but just want to confirm that if someone had a request, was looking for something, it's free. There's no monetary
Well, there is the uniform fee schedule as part of the Public Records Act. So the way that we do is we conform with that if there is a charge. If it's electronic and they're accessing it through the online portal, they're just accessing it on their own.
Right.
We do back file conversion. So the legislature for a number of years used to, even digital, it was burned onto a CD. So that requires a conversion over. When we do that for the member of the public, we do put it into retain so that people can access it. Or we still have the reel-to-reels, and we still have the audio cassettes. So whenever those are converted, but once they're converted by that public records request, they are available to retain for people to access.
Senator Clark.
And Tanya, don't you still have a copying fee if it's a paper thing?
Oh, if it was whatever original format.
And for those of us troglodytes who might want it.
Yeah. If it's born digital, then it stays in that digital format for the digital preservation system.
All right. I don't see any questions right now, so why don't we see what it looks like?
Sure.
Sorry, we're just looking at the policy Betsy Ann circulated about the draft policy for video conferencing.
We have an updated draft available that you have, but one of the things that was requested after our last meeting was to actually see what the experience was like for members of the public to get access.
So to find the updated draft will be on our website.
Yep. Or there are hard copies over here.
Okay. I'm gonna try and go to our website.
Some things open. So the digital archives, just so you're aware, we have a link to it. It includes other branch records as well. So it is called BT Retain. When it comes to General Assembly, this is what the portal looks like. It's currently out of the box. So as I mentioned, we developed a system in concert with a number of other states, and then it became partially available. It's one of the only ones that does digital preservation. So we've been focusing a lot on preserving those records that are sitting on state servers. And then in 2022, as part of a larger launch, we'll be rebranding this. So I'm going to make this look just a little bit bigger so you can see this. And Secretary Condos will start shrinking down.
And Randy and Patty, if we turn that, it's very close if we look at the corner one.
So the way that people can come in and access the portal right now is a couple different ways. One, they can come in, well, one, they can come in by different committees. So if we're looking, if someone was searching by House committee, they can come in, look through all the different committees. They can also do a free text search for that. They can come in, and once they open up, it'll go through different folders. So it is based on how it's transferred right now from the General Assembly. So here's an older one of older records that, weren't part of that. So these would be things that we digitized from that particular former committee. But going back for it, let me just browse back. You can browse through the different records here. You can get through the different committees. We can also search. I always like to search for our deputy secretary, or I guess I can search for myself, sitting in there. This one, search terms. What will happen when people start doing searching on this is that it'll come up with all the different areas where the records can show up. So if my name came up on something with House Education, they'll start filtering it down. I'm on a small screen, so unfortunately the records are going to start coming down here. But people can search, they can record, they can access it, they can see it through the portal, and then they can also download and provide it. The same with the video. I didn't know in advance that I would have downloaded one of the YouTube videos just to show you. But I can show you one that we digitized recently. It's kind of a joke within it's from the agriculture. So it's an old one that's related to wool.
Related to
wool. It's an agricultural promotional video.
Oh, okay.
In the state of Vermont, related to how to provide different wool services, like shearing and so forth. And I probably just pulled this up today to see. The other thing that'll show up on the side, and it's just on a small thing, is it kind of filters out by subject based on the statutes themselves. So every time the legislature defines a term and so forth, that's how we allow people to search, that we provide that information so they can narrow down what they're looking for. So this the way that a video would show up, again, we're working also on the portal so it can be a direct link so someone doesn't get the whole, the way this video has a little bit of a leader on it. But a video will show up right in the middle of the screen. They can watch that and play it right from there. Just to have yes, sir. When we're digitizing it, was like, oh, have you done the Have You Any Wool? And I'd be like, yes, sir, I have. But this is how a video would come up typically. And I know that you had conversations about transcripts. I know we had a conversation with Kevin recently about transcripts too. Our developer has been able to actually run its own script off of YouTube videos to provide a transcript. Again, it's as good as that, but there is a secondary. And what we've been working on is how do you pair those two together? So if someone was searching, is the transcript textual, right? But the I can stop this so you guys don't get distracted by the Have You Any Wool. But we have been looking at how to pair those two sets of records together beyond just the search. But this is right now, our goal is really the preservation piece. And then for 2022, we were able to secure a system developer in the last 18 to 24 months, which has been really helpful to us. We're also doing the boards and commissions registry that launches in January 2023. So that was a key part for us to make sure that we got that system. And now that we have the developer on site for 2022, is going to be the year of revamping the portal outside of the vendor. But that is how you access digital records across the board.
Okay, so
Yeah, Representative Coyle.
So did I hear you say something about marrying the video with the written transcript?
Yeah, so right now, the way the system is set up is it takes each type of record, right, and considers it its own. So if you have a transcript, if you had a video, if you had written testimony, those are going to be three separate distinct records. And then we use metadata to try to pull them together so people will see them together.
Okay.
So what we've been testing now is if somebody searches on a transcript, and that's the biggest kind of thing that we have when people come in and do research on the older audio, is they have to listen to the entire audio and try to figure out, legislative intent or where the committee talked about a particular bill. We've been adding the bill information when we do digitize, and we've been looking at ways that we can maybe take information from the legislature in terms of your system to enable that. We don't need too many forms of data, but what we're trying to do is say if someone searches this text, they will automatically get the transcript in the system, but they'll see a direct connector to the video as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we've been doing different development behind the scenes to try to figure out how to pair those things together, because we also have the same thing with the judiciary.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Other questions? Anything else that you think would be helpful for us to know or be thinking about as we do this work?
The other thing that I added into my written testimony is that unlike paper records, so paper records have always come to us after the biennium because they're actively used. These digital records are unique in the sense that they can actually, there's two things that we can do early, and it is something I'd like to explore with the legislature, is one, we can do a capture in the digital preservation system shortly after that record is kind of done and ready. And that to us, we have a very small staff of 18 and do a lot of different things in addition to the state archives. That to us is a more timely way to capture records, more in real time if we can do that. So that we have. The other thing that we're doing with a couple of executive branch entities right now, including the Public Utilities Commission, is we're looking at a way that our digital preservation system is actually the storage location for their records upon receipt. So the minute that a filing comes into the Public Utilities Commission, instead of going to a separate system, it's actually going to go into the digital preservation system. They'll still access it through their Public Utility Commission and everyone. Right. So it won't be obvious that you're going into this type of portal. You're just going to see the record there. And that enables us to do the preservation early. We don't have to take custody of it. The other thing that we've been working on, and we did 2 pilots this year to do that, is to automate that cycle. And that would be an excellent thing that we'd like to explore with the General Assembly, especially for YouTube, because one of the things that we've been looking at is adapters. So our digital preservation system, we did a pilot with Microsoft 365 that enables us to use the different built-in functionality of Microsoft 365, which is used heavily within the executive branch to automate the transfer and copying over to the digital preservation system. Agencies can still use the Microsoft 365 SharePoint platform or so forth. We are also doing a Twitter connector to automate that process, which allows, if someone has done a video or something embedded in a tweet, it'll actually keep that capture and render that. And then YouTube is the last one that is working. And so we do a lot of pilot projects with our developers, the actual application developers for that. I know I'm testifying on Friday I'm on the advisory committee for the Records of Congress. And so I'm doing testimony on Friday related to our 2 pilots of how we've automated and looked at that for the executive branch there. They're looking at that for the United States Senate, particularly around Microsoft 365. So those are some things that are different that in the paper world, there's one copy and it has to stay and then you have to transfer. In the digital world, there's an ability to capture a copy early for preservation purposes, and you can embargo it in the sense of not making it publicly available. But then as soon as it's ready, it can be like if there's a custody transfer, then it becomes something that we could push available. We can also use the digital preservation system without taking legal custody right away, which is something that we're looking at, like for the Public Utilities Commission, and also maybe the judiciary as well.
Questions? Yep, Senator Clarkson.
So we've discussed length of time that we hold on to certain pieces of this, right?
Mhm.
And I'm also curious, just as the Climate Council report is due tomorrow, I'm just curious what the additional pressure on storage and for you is, because it's a different type of storage, right? It's in the cloud, but those are all somewhere. And they're taking up space somewhere and they're using a lot of energy somewhere. So I'd just love to have you share with us what the impact is for you for storage.
Right.
And
So one of the reasons why some of the agencies have reached out is that we have a very low cost threshold when it comes to number of terabytes and what our annual cost is. So when we store something, we operate a couple different repositories and systems. One, we operate the state record center. So there's our paper records from all 3 branches. We don't take custody of them, but we provide the services for them because they're still in the legal custody. They're creating agency for legal purposes. Some of those records are eligible for destruction, so they'll go out afterwards, and some of them will get transferred into the archives. And then we also have the physical state archives vaults. So those, if you think about how they have the climate control and how they have the security and how they have all that, then we also have the digital archives, which has the technical digital component to that. Our cost is fairly low. So even with the videos that are coming in, it's 8 terabytes, which is our largest transfer that is 8 terabytes now. We're only at 3 terabytes in the digital archive. So if you think about these videos have been, a tipping point, and even the last session, it was just 3 cubic feet of paper records, and the rest was digital that came in that was transferred from the committees. A tipping point, but it's actually not as costly for us. And so one of the benefits of what we did in 2010 too for our physical location is that we knew we're at the tipping point of digital records for across the board for the entire state. And that has pretty much happened. COVID, I think, pushed it along a little bit faster for folks. But what we have in capacity in Middlesex is exactly what we need for paper records that are permanent, which is about 2% of everything created in the government sector. That's the only amount that's permanent overall. Some branches will have more than others, but it's really 2% of the whole volume. So for our costs, even to run this digital preservation system, even to add 8 terabytes, it's hardly, is not really that much different. It's just we do it annually. It grows, right? So it is a, kind of pay as you grow versus a building where it's a set amount, we pay the same fee for space.
Mm-hmm.
If I have 1 box on the shelf or if I have 125,000 boxes on the shelf.
Thanks.
We do have the lowest cost when you look at on-base, which is what the state uses. And then, we ran a couple of numbers when we're doing the body cam decisions and looking at the cost storage for that and what it would look like. I mean, even the digital preservation system is coming in just,
Any other questions? Great, thank you so much. We really appreciate your
And I'll
testimony
see if
time.
there's any questions that come up.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have the Executive Director from CCTV Center for Media and Democracy, Laura Glenn. Thank you for joining us today. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me okay?
We just need to raise your volume a little bit.
Maybe that's us.
All right,
That might be on our side.
I'll keep talking so you can raise the volume.
There you go.
There we go.
Perfect.
Is
Thank
that better?
you.
Well, thank you
Yes.
very much, Speaker and Senator Ballant, for the opportunity, and members of the committee. For the record, I'm Lauren Glenn Davidian. I'm the Executive Director of CCTV Center for Media and Democracy based in Burlington, Vermont. And today I'm representing the Vermont Access Network, which is 24 community media centers across the state I know you are aware of. We really appreciate your effort to make the pivot from simply remote meetings to now what we're talking about is hybrid democracy and the opportunity to let people participate both in person and remotely. The VAN members across the state are setting up these hybrid setups in dozens and dozens of towns and schools across the state. So we have a lot of experience with this, and we are standing by to help in any way. And that is why I'm testifying, is to give you some insight and some opinions on the work that you're doing. So the first is you've posed a series of recommendations regarding how to manage these public meetings, these hybrid meetings, we'll call them. You've identified that YouTube could be the platform, would be the platform. I suggested that might be a short-term solution, but for the immediate next session, YouTube will be satisfactory. You're going to be using Zoom again as the meeting platform. Again, I think in a longer-term perspective, we want to be thinking about a statewide public switch video network along lines of VIT version 2.0. I don't think that that's on the table right now, although it might be something to support with some of the ARPA funds. But in the meantime, for the short term, both Zoom and YouTube will be satisfactory, and the plan to archive by the Secretary of State. I attached in a previous memo links to other states. So we've been looking to this question of, a statewide channel, a statewide platform for public meetings, legislative meetings for a long time. Actually, we've been thinking about this since the mid-1980s. I hate to say that dates me, but there are many examples, including C-SPAN, Colorado, other states that provide a public, easy to use platform for current content as well as archive content, and also include licensing conditions, because I know that was a concern for you, the use and reuse of content excerpts. And I think that if you look at these licensing models, there's certainly could be useful, any one of them to adopt in terms of how the content is used. And I don't have to go into the detail on that, but I'm happy to, if you'd like to at any time. And those examples on the testimony, I think, give you some guidance around your concerns that this video will be used for purposes other than what we intended. And that really is addressed through licensing. I would like to bring up some short-term concerns that have been identified that I think we need to pay attention to as we go into the next era, after the next era being after massive investment in the state house is made. Whether we have massive investment or not, and whatever technology we're using, it's always in the practice. And so I just wanted to bring a couple of things to your attention. Currently, it's difficult to determine who's speaking on the remote meetings when people watch them because of the mask wearing and because microphones are not always used properly. And of course, I can just say after many, many years that it's all about the microphones, because we're not looking at a lot of visual activity, but we do need to hear what people are saying. So it's difficult to hear what's being said when legislators are not speaking into the microphone. It's difficult to see the nameplates and know who is speaking because legislators are no longer in assigned seats as they might be in the committee rooms. And the presentation of video from the House floor makes it difficult to tell who is speaking, with the exception of the person at the podium. And presentation of video from the Senate floor is better, but identifying speakers can still be difficult. So I wanted to just give you that feedback from the community of people who are trying to interact remotely, to say that, again, the practices, the technology investment is one thing, but the practices of how we use the tools become very important in order to achieve your goal and our goal of a participatory democratic process. So I think I could stop there and respond to any questions that you might have, but I do want to just emphasize that we at Vermont Access Network are very eager and standing by to help with this process and this conversion to the extent that we can. And I will, as a final thing, say I am concerned about the legislative staff's ability to manage this transition, given what has been testified to over the past several months about the workload during the pandemic, because you're asking the staff to run two meetings, an in-person meeting and a remote meeting, and they have different requirements. As you know, they've been doing, I think, a yeoman's job, but it's really important to remember, and I think you are aware, that they are now going to be asked to be doing even more when the transition happens and during the transition. So we have to make sure we're adequately staffed in the legislature to accomplish what is actually a major shift in how we do business.
Thank you.
My comments, yeah.
For those of you following along, you can find these documents that she referenced on our committee website for joint rules. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Lauren Glenn? Go ahead, Senator Clarkson.
Lauren, it's good to see you. I feel like we've been meeting on a regular basis recently. I guess my question is, I think it's exciting to think of one public access for the state house, the state house. How far away are we from that, realizing that vision?
Well, I think there's a few components, but I would single out two of them. One is that we are using YouTube as our public platform. So when people want to access content, there's an easy link in the agenda, they go to YouTube. That's great. But YouTube is a commercial platform, and other states, for example, Colorado, have essentially their own platform. That's the state of Colorado's. It might be a model that's used in other places, like Tanya was describing with the archives. But it's essentially, you go to the legislature, all the committee meetings are there. It's not a commercial third-party service. It's controlled and set up by the state. And then I think the other aspect to it, right now the state is spending thousands and thousands of dollars on Zoom and Teams. I understand Teams is integrated with Microsoft, but let's just say Zoom is thousands of dollars on Zoom as a platform. And so these are dollars that are going out of state. And while Zoom has high level functionality, Vermont Interactive TV, which is a kind of predecessor to the Zooms of the world, those models have greatly improved and could again be run by the state as a state public switch video network that would enable the legislature to connect with people across the state, but also would allow regional bodies and local bodies to connect across the state in a more sophisticated way than VIT 1.0. So these are issues to talk about more. Right now, I think we're using these third-party services just to get the job done. And, amen to that. I'm not trying to make things more complicated, but I do think that as we look ahead and we do plan, we need to think about how the state can control its own content and perhaps do it more economically, So I hope that's helpful, but I would suggest on the testimony I filed in November, I think it may be, there are those examples from the different states. It's worth looking at them because, of course, C-SPAN is the gold standard. And anything C-SPAN does, we look to. They've always been a model for us at Town Meeting TV.
You know, in previous conversations together, we have talked about needing to have a bridge and getting set up for this session, but then finding and creating time to have the long-term conversation of how we can set ourselves up for future sessions. So I think that is a conversation that will continue on during session. And this is our bridge to get there. Go ahead,
Just to tag on to that,
Yeah.
Jill, are Kevin and Lauren are we working towards that so that, for example, at some point in the session, could compare costs to what we're doing now and look at the feasibility of this so that this might be something that could be in place or considered for next sessions? I mean, how are we
So I
moving
think-
this forward?
Why don't we, if you don't mind, Kevin, coming up for a quick update, I do want to say, like, our focus right now, because IT has so much on their plate, is
Right.
to ensure that they can get us set up for January. So
I get,
there's not an expectation of having
right.
a draft plan ready to go, but I know because our IT department is fantastic, that they are thinking about this and
I know. Yeah.
a little.
For the record, Kevin Moore, Director of IT. So we are not working on that at this moment.
Right.
There are many variables and many options to consider. I would say that we would want to have at least a rough idea of which direction we want to pursue before we try to put together a menu of options. So whether it's public-private partnership, reaching out to one of the many vendors that specialize in this type of space, building something homegrown, that's always an option. VIT, as Lauren Glenn is talking about, 2.0, something of that nature. I think there are so many different directions we can take this conversation, but we're not planning that yet. We're just trying to get to January, frankly. Make sure that we are ready for everybody to work as efficiently as possible during this short time frame.
So I realize that that's what's completely consuming you at the moment. On the other hand, if we're going to move this forward, I mean, it's lovely to discuss it, but I think we also need a plan for how to move it forward. So that's all I was trying to say, is put that stake in the ground to make sure that we don't.
So a fair statement. I think I've testified on it a couple times, primarily in the advisory committee, that I would like to see something similar to what the U.S. House is doing, where it's a much more interactive site, allows for content sharing, archival access, live access to content. It's really, it's a solid model from my perspective on what we could do. And there are many vendors that play in that space, many different ways to get from here to there.
So once we get.
It's not an insignificant investment regardless. It's a fairly significant.
Yeah, no, I get it. I get that.
So I think right now we have our short-term planning to do, but when we do return in January and things are settled and the kinks are worked out, we're moving, then we can start to the next phase of more of the long-term planning. Any questions for Kevin while he's up here? All right.
Thank you.
Kevin. All right, Clerk of the House, that's Ann Ratz.
Good afternoon.
Welcome.
And that's you. For the record, that's Ann Russ, Clerk of the House. Madam Speaker, I just had for the committee today, just documents to review, or basically a re-review of the two policy drafts that you discussed at your last meeting. Those are posted on your committee webpage. They are the same as what you reviewed at the last meeting, except for one change to the committee live streaming policy draft. I'll just start again by teeing it up like you did, Madam Speaker, that these policy drafts were created for this committee to review, to see if this committee could reach consensus on the overall, an overall recommendation that this committee, which is a combination of both rules committees, if you reach agreement on a final version of these drafts, you could then take it back to your own chambers to see if your chambers would agree to these draft policies on how we live stream, record, and archive our committee meetings. So if you want to turn to the drafts that we have posted today on your committee webpage and that members have in front of them, in front of you again today. Let's start with the committee's one because it is, has more information in it because it includes video conferencing. It is not currently provided in the change of policy draft. Madam Speaker, do you want me to go back through the policy again in detail, or would the committee prefer more of a high-level overview?
I would recommend a high-level overview since we've already spent time on this, but if someone, nope.
Great. Okay, just stop me if you'd like more details. Just the policy starts with the definitions. When we're talking about video conferencing, it's how we participate in meetings through both remote and in-person means. For example, in committees, like we just had from Ms. Davidian, we had her testifying remotely. So she was in here video conferencing through you as a remote witness. When we're talking about live streaming, it's how committee meeting video conferences are broadcast online in real time, such as by YouTube. Recording means a saved record of a live stream. And then archiving is what our state archivist was describing, the managing of the method of managing our live stream recordings. So we have general principles in these policies that the chair provides general oversight of committee meeting live streaming and video conferencing and recording. That will do video conferencing over Zoom, and the committee meetings will be live streamed in an audio-visual format on YouTube. And then as far as the recordings go, they would be on a committee's webpage, and they would replace the task cam, your prior just audio recording of your committee meetings. And then for the archiving aspect of it, the committee live stream recordings would be maintained on the committee's YouTube webpage for the duration of biennium and thereafter removed and then sent to archives for the archiving thereafter. And that is that archiving matches what you did for task cams also.
Senator Clarkson?
Jill, I'm sorry. I just, just given the conversation we just had with Kevin and Lauren, I am just wondering if we should be using the specific names of like Kleenex versus tissue. Should we be using Zoom versus an online platform, or because in future, do we want to go back in statute and change the names of these businesses that we are referencing in statute?
Well, I can say at least how these draft policies are set up. You can see it at the very top, and I should have made mention of this at the beginning when I started, that these are draft policies pending any further long-term solutions. So it's in accordance essentially with the conversation that was occurring, that these would be the platforms that the legislature would be using until you'd have decided to do something different in the long term. I think for these specific platforms, and maybe you would want to hear from the Director of Legislative IT again. As I understand it, these are what are working for us now.
Right. No, I get that. So this isn't going into the green books. This is just.
Oh, correct.
That, okay. So that's what I'm trying to identify. This is sort of session law policy draft.
Yes, this would be internal legislative policy that each chamber would adopt for itself by whatever method the chamber chose to do.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So we are on page 2 on the specific procedures, and this really gets into more the nitty-gritty details of how those general principles would be implemented. And so under the conduct of the meeting, as is usual, the chair directs the committee assistants to begin the live stream. And then in A2, in regard to witnesses and remote participants, this is the only change from your prior draft. In your prior draft, you had language in this A2 in regard to remote witness testimony that witnesses, including legislative staff, may testify remotely in consultation with the chair or designee. After discussing with the speaker and at the speaker's direction, I removed this language for this revised draft as this staff issue could instead be discussed in the Joint Legislative Management Committee, because as we did discuss in our general principles, of legislative authority. The Joint Legislative Management Committee has a general focus on the general oversight, management, and coordination of staff. So that is the one revision from this policy that you reviewed last time.
Thank you, Betsy Ann. Just a reminder for members that are not serving on Joint Legislative Management Committee, we are in the process of updating and organizing universal HR policies for staff. And so upon looking at those policies, it seemed to make sense that that conversation was a better fit for what was already happening in, with Joint Legislative Management Committee. So if that's an issue or a topic that you want to follow or be part of, be on the lookout for the next Joint Legislative Management Committee meeting. Thank you.
But in that topic of remote participants, the second part of that subdivision 2 remains, which is that the chair authorizes the committee assistant to allow remote participants into the Zoom live stream and the Zoom waiting room, and thereafter manage it to the extent to which those individuals remain there. Under 3, just as a reminder, live streaming would be required so that if the committee is made aware at any time that the live stream has crashed, the committee will pause its meeting, discontinue discussion of legislative business until the live stream has been restored in order to maintain that public access. And then we had flagged last time, and it is still flagged. Number 4, in regard to the method of transcription, that was an open question. We discussed at the last meeting the 2 options. We have our current Zoom real-time live stream, closed captioning, which attempts to interpret what I'm saying now as I'm speaking and provides live, real-time transcription of what I'm saying. But the issue with that, because it's trying to interpret me in real time, it doesn't always get it right, particularly for me, as someone who speaks quickly. But the issue with the Zoom closed captioning is that those words are getting embedded into the record. And so if there is a obvious and potentially problematic error in it reflecting that I said something that I certainly did not say, and it causes an issue, that will be embedded into the meeting record because it's text that gets permanently embedded into the video, and really the only way to correct it is to blur out those words. The other option for closed captioning is what YouTube offers, and that is getting done anyway. As YouTube prepares the live stream record, it is preparing a closed captioning to go along with it, but it needs time to process it. So the YouTube closed captioning does not become available until sometime after the live stream is ended. It could take up to 24 to 48 hours. The longer the live stream recording, the longer the amount of time generally that it takes to become available. The shorter the live stream, usually the shorter it takes to become available. But once that that closed captioning record is available, one can just press the closed captioning button when they're watching the YouTube recording later after it gets posted, and there is closed captioning, which, because it had more time to get processed, is generally more accurate. So I'm just flagging that there as an issue to work out. That's still an open question. And then for ending a live stream, of course, the chair, as general person with oversight, directs the committee assistant to end the live stream.
Yeah.
Are you wanting to weigh in now?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd vote for accuracy.
So on the transcription portion, we reached out to several advocacy organizations to get and stakeholders to get some feedback from them. We have not gotten enough feedback to bring to the group. So what I would ask here is we wait on this part and let's keep on going. But my hope is that we could have consensus on the policy as a whole and move these conversations forward, just to keep the ball rolling to House and Senate rules and keeping in touch to see if there's consensus on that point. Given what we find out, that's great. If we need to pull the committee back together, we can do that as well.
So we are on page 3, almost at the end of this committee policy draft. This subdivision B gets into necessary trimming of the live stream recording. We discussed this last time. If a live stream recording contains non-legislative business and air, the chair can request that Leg IT trim those non-legislative business portions, Ledge IT, with the process that is used, consults with the Office of Legislative Counsel's Public Records Officer to confirm authority to trim the specified portion. And then if that confirmation is given, then Ledge IT trims that and reposts the trim version so it truly reflects actual legislative business. There would be, in regard to temporary legislative maintenance, again, just to get into more specifics, that the live stream records are maintained, again, for the duration of the biennium, and then taken down and would be sent to BSARA as a digital copy that the BSARA would maintain as an archive. And you can find them there. And thank you to the state archivist for providing an overview of how the public can now access our recordings that we send to them.
Yes. All right. Any questions for Betsy Ann about what's currently in this draft policy? All right, without opening up
I do
to
have a
discussion.
question,
Oh,
and-
go ahead, Senator Brock.
And this probably is as much a policy question as it is what's in the document itself. When live streaming goes down, we stop doing business. So essentially, the legislature is entirely dependent upon the technological resiliency of a platform that we don't control. And I wonder if that's wise policy. For example, we don't think that Zoom will go down for any period of time. We think it's a good technology. But any technology can stop. We've had examples of that with major technology platforms in which they've been broken for an hour, for 2 hours, and in some cases for 24 hours. Do we want to be so dependent that we have no other alternative than to try to collect a joint rules committee to change something that we've locked into permanency? And I don't think that's a wise idea.
So let's open up discussion on this point. Senator Clarkson?
So Randy, we're already dependent on electricity. The minute the electricity goes out, we're out of business too. I'm just saying, I mean, our committee.
I here carry candles in my briefcase.
I would do work with you by candlelight any day. But I also would acknowledge that the minute we are dependent on electricity also. We are dependent on a number of things. And it's a good question, but it is one in some ways that there are lots of things we don't control that we're dependent on.
Well, let me, an example, the pre-pandemic example is what we do to record meetings. We had a tape recorder, and I can think of numerous examples where somebody forgot to turn the tape recorder on, where there are some committees that didn't tape, and as a routine matter, it is certainly in the Senate. And there are just simply failures. And so we have a long history in which we have not recorded and not made a permanent record of every meeting that we've had. This is a major change in our policy. And again, we're becoming very, very dependent really upon a single vendor's ability to stay resilient and locking ourselves into the notion of going out of business. There's a difference between recording on YouTube and having electricity in the building.
Before I open up to other points, I just want to raise to you that since the pandemic began, it has been House policy that as soon as there's an interruption, we wait
I understand.
for the purpose of transparency and participation. So it has been a longstanding policy. Like now, I feel like we can say longstanding policy. It feels like it's been forever, but it has been the policy that's been, and I'll say it has been working well in the House, that we've not had very long distractions and disruptions. And there are other factors, like Senator Clarkson mentioned, like electricity. I can think of times where it wasn't the platforms, but it was a thunderstorm coming through or something of that nature. And it was important to us to make sure that everyone could participate in the process. Senator Balance.
Well, I certainly take Senator Brock's concerns seriously and to heart. I do think there is a difference between losing electricity. It doesn't happen very often, whereas we have a fair amount of glitches that we have to endure because of, as you said, a vendor that we can't control. The other piece of this, just to highlight why it's been more challenging for us in the Senate, is that we don't have committees all day. So if you shut down your committee in the House in the morning because of a technological glitch, it's possible that you can make up some of that time in the afternoon. Whereas on the Senate side, if we have to shut down, then we lose an entire day of testimony. I just want to like make that explicit. That is a difference between how we structure our work, and it does impact us in different ways. So,
Yeah.
so that's, I just want to make that explicit.
So I think going back to Senator Clarkson's point about specifically naming YouTube and Zoom, don't name the platform, and the platform for whatever reason crashes and is down for 5 days or whatever, and you have to, IT, I'm looking at Kevin Moore, try to quickly come up with a new way of video conferencing. Does this preclude us, or does it hinder us by naming the platforms that we're using? Is there a way we can say, you know, currently on YouTube or currently using Zoom, and then if there's a reason, I don't know, I'm just trying to figure out something.
Hold on, let me see. Do we have a response from staff on that question?
I think we could come up with language. I'm curious to see what the director.
I thought that's what you pointed out, Betsy Ann, at the beginning, which is it's pending any further, you know, it's qualified.
Right.
I thought you answered my concern by saying it was qualified here at the beginning.
So I'll stay out of the policy side of it. As far as language goes, I think that for our users to be able to pivot in the event of a platform failure, staying vendor agnostic in our language is certainly understandable and acceptable to me, to be able to allow us to stay within policy, but be able to provide an alternate approach to achieving the end goal, which is video conferencing or live streaming.
So Betsy Ann, we could say, we could just use the definitions on top, just to be as broad as possible and flexible as possible.
Sure, yes, that could be one option. Or have this other language to say that alternative methods of live streaming could be used in case of these failing.
Yeah.
So it's just however you
Yeah.
want to approach it, like we want to remove the names, or if you want to have some sort of catch-all language, like Senator Brock's scenario he's mentioning. Because I think we do have potential backup systems that might be possible.
So there's always a way to pivot to different technologies. Some are easier than others. Some are, more readily available than others. But being able to have that flexibility and policy to pivot,
Mhm.
I think is important. Now we have some pretty resilient platforms, to their credit. We've had far fewer issues over time as they as well.
It's not like this is a big problem that we're having to solve. We've done pretty well.
I think we've done fairly well in the grand scheme of things. But certainly, again, at the policy level, trying to stay vendor agnostic, I think is certainly a reasonable approach from my perspective.
Right. Senator Brock?
Well, the notion of switching to a separate live stream vendor within 24 hours is pretty unlikely, I think.
I would say that's very unlikely in 24 hours, but I would say that we accomplished it in about 6 business days at the beginning of the pandemic. It wasn't polished, to be fair. There were a lot of bumps that we had to endure along the way. But a quick pivot in the event of a catastrophic failure of a vendor would, I don't know, it's probably a week, 2 weeks, best case scenario to make sure that we are successfully pivoting.
So essentially what we're saying is that we're willing to allow the legislature to come to a halt for a week. And it seems to me that we need a better contingency plan if we're going to do something like this, if we're going to put this kind of stricture on the legislature, that you've got to stop doing business where you can't live stream, which is what we're saying here. And whether or not there is a middle ground of some sort of a contingency plan that says if and when live streaming fails for a period of time, that we have the ability to deal, for example, with audio recording using mechanical devices in lieu of that, so that we aren't tying ourselves up with essentially no contingency plan.
Or we used to use VPR in the House floor to record the House floor?
So some of the systems we had in use in the past, we used a Tascam branded digital recording device previously in committee. That is certainly something we could pivot to quickly if we needed to, again, not get into the policy of it. The VPR live streams that are provided from the House chamber and the Senate chamber would still continue in addition to these live streams. So those aren't going anywhere. Those would be secondary points of access for folks who need it. And I believe it's only the Senate that records their floor sessions at this point. I don't believe the House does that, aside from the YouTube live streaming side of it now.
But you still have the committee issues to deal with as well.
And that would be potentially handled if the policy permits with a digital recorder.
Right. But Randy, what about Zoom days instead of snow days? Wouldn't it be nice actually to get caught up on all our other? I might look forward to a couple Zoom days.
Well, so here's something to put on the table. I hear your concern, Senator Brock, and what I'm wondering is if we can move forward with at least getting the discussion about the live streaming and video conferencing out to our House and Senate committees with the understanding that we will work on a policy that's the plan B if something happens. And we can continue that conversation. I'll put that out there for discussion. Thoughts, comments, feedback?
Sounds good.
Okay.
I
Senator
know
Brock?
we haven't had one yet, but we haven't had a policy.
I know. I mean, this is what's important about this is I think we have been working without policies this entire time during the pandemic. And so I think it's really important for us to be clear and transparent about how we're operating and why I just think taking these steps is important. And we want to be flexible and thoughtful too about covering all of our bases. So we could move the conversation forward or with these policies with the understanding that we'll be coming back with the backup plan at our next meeting.
Sounds good.
Does that work for everyone, Senator Brock?
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Okay. So on the committee one that we are looking at right now, the committee policy, I would look, we don't need a formal motion or vote. This is just a consensus that we are sending this over to the next committee of jurisdiction for them to consider and vote on. Are there any objections to sending this along, or are we ready to go on this one with the understanding that we will be taking up additional policy on the backup plan?
I just want to, so we're keeping Zoom and YouTube in there now.
For the time,
Working that.
with the qualifier at the top for the time being, right?
Pending further long-term solutions.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's potential language that could be added. I don't know if it completely addresses your concerns, but maybe adding some language that other methods of live streaming and recording, be it audio or audio visual, may be used as necessary in circumstances when the methods described in this policy are not immediately available.
Ooh,
Oh,
Betsy. And
so good. Does that sound good?
It does.
Yep. Yep. Okay, with that change.
And that's why she's a house nurse.
Okay. All right, I'm seeing head shaking and consensus. Thank you. Let's go.
Go, good to go.
Committee. All right, so now let's move.
Thank you, Betsy, and for you.
All right, so now we have session, right? Big committees, chambers, thank you.
That's why she's paid the big.
Keeping track, am I hearing that the committee with that addition would be overall recommending this?
That's correct.
So the committee policy,
Committee.
okay, so the committees of jurisdiction.
Correct.
Terrific, great. I'll put that into your spreadsheet. Sorry.
Oh, you okay?
You warned me on one end. Is that your phone?
No, I tripped over Randy's.
Oh, thanks, I've done that.
Oh,
All right, so sorry.
Sure, we're okay. Oh, watch.
Didn't have my glasses on, Randy.
All right, so let's move to session.
All right, so this one is simpler because it removes the video conferencing elements. Everything is the same except it applies it to the chamber environment. So we've still got live streaming, we've still got recording, and we've still got archiving as our definitions. We're not using video conferencing because as we described at our last meeting, This policy does not address whether legislators would participate remotely in sessions. So this does not contemplate that decision. That would be up to each chamber to make whether they would want to engage in hybrid sessions. So we start again with the general principles of this chamber policy, which is that the presiding officer has general oversight of chamber session live streaming and recording. Chamber sessions are live streamed on an in an audio-visual format on YouTube. They're recorded automatically on YouTube, on the chamber webpage, and it may supplement, this language provides in C2, this recording may supplement the chamber's journal, which is the constitutionally provided record of the chamber's votes and proceedings. As far as archiving goes, same principle as the committee policy draft, that the chamber live stream recordings will be maintained on the chamber's YouTube webpage for the duration of the biennium and thereafter removed and then provided to ISARA for archiving as a digital file. Similar specific procedures for the conduct of the meeting, presiding officer directs parliamentary staff to begin the live stream. The same language that if at any time the chamber is made aware that the live stream has crashed, the chamber must recess its meeting and discontinue discussion of legislative business until the live stream has been restored. There's that open question on transcription. And then for ending, the presiding officer directs parliamentary staff to end the live stream. There's that same trimming language with some tweaks for the chamber environment, which is that if it contains non-legislative business, the parliamentary staff may request Leg IT to trim specific portions of the recording to remove that non-legislative business. Leg IT would consult with the chamber's parliamentarian to confirm the authority to do so. And if the parliamentarian confirms, then Leg trims to remove that non-Leg business. Then for the recording, they are maintained on the webpage for the biennium and then sent to ISARA for the remainder of the time. And I could also add, if you would like to do the same thing you did for the chamber one, that for the committee one, that this chamber policy could add that same language about essentially the backup methods.
Yeah, that would be great. And same goes for this too, that we can have the backup plan discussion at our next,
Right.
that would go consistently with this as well.
Sounds good.
Any other thoughts or feedback on this one or chamber one? Okay. Do we have consensus that this one is good to go with those two caveats?
Yes.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay. All right. All right. Thank you. So stay tuned for next steps on that. And with that, I just want to give folks a minute to regroup on our next agenda item, which is the draft vaccination or test policy. I'll give Damien a moment to get settled up here. And folks, you can bring up your copy of that. It's on our legislative website, and there are copies at the table there.
This doesn't appear in
No.
these things, correct?
Right. Okay. So this is legislative vaccination or test policy, draft 2.2, 11/29/2021. Everyone ready? You have the doc?
Yep.
All right, so this is our next policy discussion as we come back to figure out how we can come back safely in the building and have everything that we can do to make sure we're creating a safe environment for us to work in. And so I will turn it over to Legislative Counsel Damian Leonard to help give us a little bit more context and history on how we got to this draft.
Great, thank you. For the record, Damian Leonard, Legislative Counsel. Good afternoon, everyone. So
Hi,
nice
Dave.
to see many of you in person again after 2 years. So to back us up here, on November 5th, the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration issued an emergency temporary standard requiring all employers with 100 or more employees to either require mandatory vaccinations or to require employees who are not vaccinated to be tested at least once a week for COVID-19 and to wear masks all the time. As most of you probably know at this point, that standard was immediately challenged in federal court and is currently stayed and sitting in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration filed a motion at the beginning of last week to have the stay lifted, and the court issued a briefing schedule for the stay. The deadline for filing a motion in support of lifting the stay is, I believe, today. It may have been yesterday. And then by the 10th, all briefing on the motion will be done. There is a very slim chance that the court could decide to lift the stay before briefing is finished. More likely than not, it will wait till after briefing is finished and then decide whether or not to lift the stay at that point. So what does this mean for us before I even get to the standard? So the compliance date for the first part of the standard is December 5th, which is before the court is likely to rule on this. However, it's not clear if the court did lift the standard, how long we would have to come into compliance. So there is the potential that we're going to be required, because as a state government entity in a state plan occupational safety state, we are subject to these standards. And as of December 13th, we will have more than 100 employees as we gear up for the session. And so we're in a position where if this standard takes effect, we're going to have to comply, but we don't know if it's going to take effect. The Sixth Circuit, many of the prognosticators think it's unlikely to uphold the standard, but there's still a chance. Something I always told clients when I was in litigation is, even if you think you have the best case, the best facts, the best judge, there's still a 1 in 4 chance that there's something in the case that the judge doesn't like and they rule against you. So there is always a chance that the standard gets upheld. The appeal is likely, either side is likely to appeal it up to the Supreme Court. But we don't know if the stay is going to be in place after the decision, or if the stay will be lifted pending a final decision on the standard. So we've got a lot of unknowns. What does it mean for us as an employer? Well, one, it means that staff are going to have to provide proof of vaccination or notify us that they're not vaccinated. For anyone who's not vaccinated, it means they're going to be required to do weekly testing. Now, we're not required to pay for or provide the testing, but in order to make that simpler for staff, the easiest way to do it is to provide some sort of testing on site, so that staff can do that. The other benefit of doing something like that, especially if you open it up to everyone, is that there are no stigmas attached to anyone who has to get a test. So individuals may not be vaccinated because they chose not to be vaccinated, because they have a health condition, because they have a religious reason for not being vaccinated. There's any number of reasons. So by offering testing on site, if you chose to do that, it is easy for staff, and I'm getting a little bit off track here, but then it also avoids any stigma issues. On a broader sort of level here, the other question is, what about the legislators in the building? So the way Vermont statute is written, the definition of employee could arguably include a legislator, and it could arguably not include a legislator. So that's why you have a policy in front of you today. And so there is an argument out there, potentially, if this standard comes into play, that legislators either need to be vaccinated or need to be tested on a weekly basis, and need to be masked. We already have a masking policy in place. I assume something similar will be adopted going into the session. So that means that we need to address the issues of vaccination and testing. And that's where Betsy's proposal comes into place. We're also working on a policy for staff that would be approved by the Joint Legislative Management Committee. And that goes into more details for staff regarding, for example, time off to get vaccinated, and that sort of thing, which is required by the policy. The other things that we need to start thinking about are when, given that we don't know what the compliance timeline is going to be if the standard takes effect, we need to think, at least initially, about what our timeline is going to be, and then be able to make adjustments on the fly. But as a very practical matter, we have the holidays coming up. We have a limited amount of time for legislative committees to approve these policies and then to get notice out to members and to staff and so forth. So this is more of a high level sort of policy question that I want to highlight for you. And we need to also understand that if the policy takes effect, we may have a very short period of time to make adjustments to those dates and speed them up. And then we may have people who are struggling to come into compliance, and we'll need to help both members and staff figure out how to comply with whatever policy we put in place. Are there other questions there? Sorry, I went a little off track in the middle. I feel terrible.
Could you tell us what is the current policy that is being used right now by the administration and state employees?
So the executive branch has an attestation policy in place. So that means that you submit an attestation as to your vaccination status. So I would say, yes, I've been vaccinated. And then if that's the case, I'm not required to test, but I may test. So testing is open to all employees in the executive branch, but it's only required of employees who have not attested that they're fully vaccinated. The difference with the standard here is we actually need proof of the vaccination. And it's only if you've exhausted all reasonable efforts to get that proof and you can't do it, that you can then file an attestation. But the attestation under that is under, has to require employees to state that they understand that falsifying it is subject to criminal penalties, and a violation or a false statement under OSHA can subject you to up to 6 months in prison and a $10,000 fine. So it's, and that is not something that the executive branch has put into place at this point. Because the OSHA standard wasn't in place before this. So we would have to have a stricter attestation and actually collect proof, whether that's a photo of a vaccination card or a printout from your doctor's office or something like that.
Senator Ballard?
Damian, what is the situation right now in the executive branch if there are members of the public coming into executive branch offices?
I don't know how the executive branch is treating that. There may be others here who can answer that question better. It gets a lot more difficult when you're talking about members of the public versus your own employees. With employees, it can be sort of a condition of employment. I know we have a mask requirement here in the building, but that's something that you can enforce visually. Versus having to review some sort of proof of vaccination or requiring same-day testing or something like that, all of which have a lot more logistical challenges than just monitoring people for mask use.
Thank you.
Other questions for Damian? We'll have the clerk come up and do a thorough walkthrough, but any level questions for Damian?
Well, not a question as much as just to make explicit for people who are following this. As you said, it's not clear whether members of the House and Senate fall under the definition of employee. And I think that's a really important point for the public to understand as well, is that although we lead our chambers, we are not the bosses of the people in our chambers, right? The people have their jobs because their constituents elected them to those jobs. And it gets very tricky to figure out, you have to enable people who have been duly elected to be able to fulfill their constitutional obligation to their constituents. And so that is just why we haven't gotten there, but I want to make sure that that is also part of what we have to wrestle with.
Right, and it's important to note that, for a staff person like me, if, for example, I couldn't be vaccinated and I had a reason why I couldn't do meet the testing requirement, I might still be required to get an accommodation such as working remotely, which would, or, if I had some other reason why I can't be in the building. But for all of you, there are constitutional complications and rules that may prevent you from actually discharging your constitutional duty to your constituents if you cannot be in the building. And so it is definitely a different calculus there, and it's not a clear or settled question as to whether legislators would be covered by this mandate. So there, are a number of policy wrinkles here that you will need to consider.
Does the Sergeant at Arms have a policy with regards to the public, or when we have lobbyists coming in?
Not at this time.
Not at
We're
this time.
starting with
Okay.
staff and us, and
Okay.
then we'll talk about, that's a topic for a future meeting.
Okay.
All right. Seeing no further questions, thank you, Damian. And next up, we'll have the clerk of the house, Betsy Ann, to walk us through this. I think it is important for us to think about as we're working on different tools and guidelines and protocols to keep us safe. We have masks in place. We're talking about the live stream and recording so that people feel safe participating at home. Given our special session on Monday, I thought that was a good test run for us. And we got a lot of positive feedback about having rapid testing available. There's been lots of questions about what our policy is going to be around vaccines and testing. So I think not only do we have what's happening with the court process with the federal administration's plan, but it is important for us also to be thinking about this now anyway, regardless. So with that, I will turn it over to Betsy Ann.
All right, thank you. And thank you to Damian for giving that overview. We have posted on your committee webpage, if you need a handy reference, this document summarizes the pending federal, they call ETS, Emergency Temporary Standard. And then this document is from the executive branch, and it provides frequently asked questions to the administration's current requirement for executive branch state employees to be either vaccinated and provide an attestation to that effect, or submit to weekly COVID testing and wear a face mask in the workplace. So at the speaker's request, I drafted for your discussion today a legislative vaccine or test policy that is based on that pending federal ETS and the current executive branch requirements. It is that draft 2.2 that's posted on your webpage. And thank you to the Secretary or Senate Secretary's office, Office of Legislative Counsel, and the Office of Legislative Human Resources for working with the First Assistant Clerk and me in creating this draft. We all put our heads together and compared the two policies to put the language in front of you today for your consideration and discussions. So to summarize, this policy draft would require all legislators and staff to either provide proof or an attestation that they are fully vaccinated against COVID-19, or to submit to weekly COVID-19 testing. This policy draft envisions that you still have your face mask policy in place regardless of your vaccination status. Before I get into the details of this policy draft, I'll just note as a preliminary matter, as we did for your live streaming drafts, that because other entities in the legislative branch ultimately have control over enforcement of individuals in this building, this policy draft is like that live streaming draft, or any revised version of it that you press to this, that it's treated as a recommendation that those entities would implement to require these for either their members or their staff. And when I'm saying the entities with authority, again, I'm talking about the House itself overall for House members and House staff, the Senate for its senators and Senate staff, and then the Joint Legislative Management Committee for all other legislative staff, because that is the entity that has ultimate oversight over legislative staff. But this recommends a policy, again, as a universal idea that would be imposed in this building for everyone who works here, at least legislators and staff at this point. I can talk to you at a future date about any other building-wide potential policy revisions. But this draft would require, as we start out generally, in the draft you're looking at, it just provides the general summary of what this policy would require. It provides that all legislators and legislative staff entering legislative spaces in the Capitol complex, and then we provide a list of what that includes, State House and our other legislative space buildings, shall, as a condition of entry into the legislative space, do either of the following. One, demonstrate full vaccination against COVID-19 as set forth in subsection B, or on a weekly basis, provide proof of a negative COVID-19 test taken within the last 96 hours as set forth in subsection C. So it's the vax or test. Those are the two options as a condition of entering our legislative spaces. Subsection B describes what it means to be fully vaccinated, and it's based on the federal ETS and the administration's policy. Full vaccination means that you've gotten either, it's been at least 2 weeks since your 2-dose of vaccine, such as the Moderna or Pfizer, or 2 weeks since your single-dose vaccine, for a single-dose vaccine like the Johnson & Johnson. The ETS at this time, nor the administration, doesn't require boosters. Those boosters would not be required under this policy. How it would work to provide proof that you're fully vaccinated, you would provide that proof, which would be your vax card, or if unable to provide that proof, an attestation, like the administration does, that you are fully vaccinated, to the Office of Legislative Human Resources. Office of Legislative Human Resources would be the entity receiving this information. The Office of Legislative Human Resources shall maintain copies of that proof of full vaccination and the attestations provided to it in the manner set forth in subsection D, which goes into the maintenance and confidentiality of these records. So under full vaccination, proof or attestation submitted to Office of Legislative Human Resources. That takes us to the bottom of page 1. We get to the top of page 2. You see there's that language explicitly that, oh, sorry.
Senator Clarkson, yes.
Sorry, may I just ask a question?
Yeah.
I've just come from New York over the holidays where you can't do anything without showing your vaccination card and your identity. And so this is so routine around the world now that but an attestation is a little bothersome. Is the HR, and I know Arlene's here, is HR able to confirm with our Department of Health or the CDC that attestation is actually accurate? I mean, because otherwise I would not be comfortable with an attestation.
Does the head of HR have if not, that's okay. We can come back to it. We can flag it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something for us to flag because they have to then have the authority to be able to confirm it, or it's, I think, pointless.
The way that this is currently written is that the legislator or staff member would have to provide proof of full vax with your vax card.
Right.
Or if unable to provide that proof, shall attest that they are fully vaccinated on a form provided by the office. So if, as currently written, it would be up to the individual, essentially swearing that they are being truthful, that they are fully vaccinated, and that they are unable to provide full proof of vaccination.
I get that. My question is.
Yes.
Is the HR director able to confirm that?
I don't know. I'm not certain. I'm going to turn to the director. I'm not certain if we have access to that type of sensitive medical information. That they- My thought is that
Arlene, sorry, do you mind just coming up to the stand so we can hear you? If you could just state your name and position.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Arlene Donovan, HR Director. So, sorry, question. At this time, I don't know that I have access to that information. I probably would not unless the individual is actually willing to hand over their vaccination card, which I think is the point of the attestation. It's usually signed in absence of that information, and they are, as Betsy Ann indicated, they would be legally signing a document saying that they are swearing that they have received the vaccine. However, in this particular case, they, for whatever reason, are unable to locate proof of that vaccine, which would probably be in rare instances, but could happen to someone, I suppose.
Do you have a follow-up question or you?
Well, someone somewhere has to be able to confirm with our Department of Health or with the CDC. I mean, otherwise that you can't prove that they haven't.
Yep.
So,
All right.
I mean, I think that's an issue that we have to resolve somewhere. And it strikes me that it shouldn't be that difficult.
All right, Arlene, I'm just gonna, I see Damien want to answer that question. Thank you, Arlene. If you can
Just something to
come up, Damien, and then we'll go to your question.
So just to answer your question, Senator Clarkson, at least with respect to the employees, the way it's set up is the employees, and there are a variety of ways you can get your vaccination information. Vermont Department of Health should have it.
Right.
Your physician may have it. The entity that you got the vaccination from should have it. The way the federal standard is set up is only if the employee has exhausted all reasonable efforts to get it from those entities can they use the attestation. But the attestation does not require the employer to then seek that information out, much of which is likely protected by health confidentiality law, which would prevent a lot of these entities from sharing it from someone who hasn't been designated to receive that. So it's really only as a last step after you've exhausted the effort of going to the Department of Health and saying, I went to that pop-up clinic in Burlington in July, and I got my Johnson & Johnson shot, and then, but I lost the card or something like that. And then they can look and try to find those records. And if for some reason that record's lost, or for example, you may have gotten vaccinated overseas, and then come back and you don't have a way of contacting the vaccination clinic where you got it overseas. The attestation asks for things like the date, the vaccine used, and as much information as you can provide, and then includes that language at the end that says, I affirm that this is true to the best of my knowledge and acknowledge that a false statement may be subject to criminal penalties. So it's essentially saying this is under pains of potential penalties. You're telling us as truthfully as you can remember and as fully as you can remember that this is the case. And this is after you've contacted your doctor and the Department of Health, and possibly whatever other entity might have been involved in the vaccination, and exhausted all those options that you then do this. But I mean, proof of it could be that picture that many of us have now taken and put on our cell phones, so that if we do go to that restaurant where they're asking for proof of vaccination, we've got it with us and we don't have to remember the paper card. So, and that would satisfy the standard at that point, as long as it's a legible picture. So does that help a little bit with your question?
I already knew all that. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
The challenge here is that there is no way to follow up.
and that,
Because, there needs to be a way, without the state spending a fortune on investigations to follow up that attestation.
and I'm not sure that there is absent.
I mean, but it's
Yeah.
fine. I get it.
Yeah.
Okay. Representative McFly?
I just, that was my question. A lot of us just went on the Vermont Health website. And I went to the Holiday Inn in Rutland with 600 other people one day. Did the information actually migrate over into the Vermont State's website was my question.
And
On a daily basis, 600 people every day for weeks and weeks. So
Mine did. I checked. So, I think most people's have.
yeah,
it's
hopefully.
fine. I have my
but
card. I don't
yeah.
care, but.
Right,
your-
no,
your
all good
card
questions.
Is, at least for purposes of the standard, your card is sufficient proof.
Yeah.
So, and that's the going to the website is like the second option.
Yeah.
If you've lost your card.
Okay.
Which is sufficient for us to, for purposes of the employees, either get a JPEG from someone or scan it, and just keep a physical photocopy.
Great. Thank you, Damian. That's helpful. All right, Betsy, let's keep on walking through. And members, if you do have a question as we get through something, don't wait to the end. Let's just address it as we go along. Thank you.
All right. So the number one default is proof of vaccination or attestation. If you cannot do that because you are not vaccinated, then your other option is testing. So subsection C gets into testing. Specifically, it is a weekly testing requirement, consistent with the EPS and the administration standard. So this language I'm on page 2 in subsection C provides in subdivision 1 that testing is required. It starts out in subdivision A by saying, unless exempted under subdivision B or C, a legislator or legislative staff member who is not in compliance with the full vaccination requirements of subsection B of this policy shall provide as a condition of entry to legislative spaces on each first weekday that the individual returns to a legislative space, proof of a negative COVID-19 test taken within the last 96 hours. Now, why 96? Because as we'll see, we'll go on that there will be testing provided, PCR type testing on a Friday that you could have your results back if you're a legislator returning on Tuesday. So this would apply to people who have not provided that proof of vaccination to our Office of Legislative HR. Now, subdivision B does get into exemptions. Medical and religious exemptions may be requested. So under subdivision B, Roman numeral I, an individual may be granted a medical exemption from COVID-19 testing, and if appropriate, a reasonable accommodation, if the individual provides to the Office of Legislative Human Resources a signed statement from a licensed healthcare provider certifying that the testing is or may be detrimental to the individual's health. And I believe this language uses customary medical exemption language. Similarly,
Senator Bell.
Betsy Ann, just to clarify, is the assumption in A that you are getting a PCR test before Monday, or is the assumption that if you don't get a PCR test, you're going to do a rapid test when you come in the building?
yeah, we'll see that. We'll get to that on page 3. And
Okay,
yeah, both
sit tight,
options
no
will be
problem.
available, but
Okay.
very intuitive. Thank you. We will get to that on the next page. For religious exemptions, an individual may be granted a religious exemption from COVID-19 testing, and if appropriate, a reasonable accommodation if the individual provides to the Office of Legislative Human Resources an attestation that the individual is prevented from undergoing such testing based on a sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance. Again, standard, as I understand it, religious exemptions language. So for these exemptions, the Office of Legislative Human Resources will prepare forms for requesting exemptions and, if appropriate, reasonable accommodations, and may consult with our Office of Legislative Counsel and the individual supervisor prior to granting an exemption and, if appropriate, a reasonable accommodation under this subdivision. So there would be a process there for requesting those exemptions. Subdivision C is another exemption from testing. And I might turn back to Damian to help describe the reason for this, but I believe it relates to COVID staying in your system potentially after you've been COVID positive. So this language can also be found in the administration's FAQs and maybe in the ETS. I'm not sure if Damian is confirming, yes. that an individual who has received a positive COVID-19 test or has been diagnosed with COVID-19 by a licensed healthcare provider shall not be required to undergo COVID-19 testing for 90 days following the date of the individual's positive test or diagnosis. I believe that's because COVID does show up in a person's system. I am seeing Damien and saying, Damien, confirm if that is correct.
Questions?
All right.
The train confirms.
So we're on page 3 now in regard to the method of testing. Thank you, Senator Ballot. So the Sergeant at Arms, and thank you to the Sergeant, would be involved in this policy. And the Sergeant at Arms office would be providing for the weekly test required under this policy and shall arrange one or more areas within the Capitol complex to provide this testing. I think she might have some ideas already in mind on where this might be able to get set up to allow people who want to get tested that access to that building before they go into our other legislative spaces. So this language provide in subdivision 2B that the Sergeant at Arms office will provide its nucleic acid amplification tests, which are NATs, on Fridays, so that those results are available at the beginning of the following week. I just provided a footnote. I'm learning all this scientific language here as we're dealing with this. So a NAT includes the PCR testing that we're used to. There's also LAMP testing. I provided a hyperlink to a CDC summary if you want to look at the other tests that are available under this NAT testing. But we know, I think, most familiar with the PCR testing. That's the kind that normally takes 48 hours. So that's where that 96 hours comes in. So on a Friday, the Sergeant at Arms would be providing that PCR type testing so that those results that normally take a couple days, you'd have them back when you come back to the building on Monday or Tuesday. So those results will be available. But the Sergeant at Arms would also be providing antigen, AKA rapid testing. So those two options for testing. So the people who are required to test under this policy shall, on a weekly basis, submit to either a NAT on a Friday if they are returning to the Capitol complex on the following Monday or Tuesday, or they also have the option of a rapid test on the first day of the week that they return to the Capitol complex. So either or. So rapid tests are available. You are familiar now, about 15 minutes. In accordance with, I believe, the administration language currently, individuals can self-administer their tests, but the results need to be read by a third party under the current standards. So this language currently provides that the results would need to be read by or in the presence of the office of the Sergeant at Arms. So it's not that someone could just say, yep, I'm good, no problem, I tested negative. Sergeant at Arms would be reading the results. And in the final little subdivision 3, so we've got our Sergeant at Arms testing, but this language would say that individuals can also get tests from outside entities at their own expense in order to comply with this policy, so long as those tests otherwise conform to the provisions of the policy, which includes that third party or office of Sergeant at Arms reading of results.
Any questions?
So just to clarify, if they choose to do a rapid test here, then we are covering the cost of that. If they are trying to do it at home, then they are not going to be submitting for reimbursement because we have the option of a free version here. Is that correct? Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Jill.
Senator Clarkson?
So most of, in fact, maybe all our academic institutions in Vermont are requiring proof of vaccination and testing once a week. So at the moment, my husband gets tested once a week at Dartmouth and once a week at VLS. Why are we thinking about not having testing for all of us? Because we all can carry COVID, whether we know it or not. I mean, we clearly have breakthrough cases. So I'm just puzzled why we're not making it and testing.
And it's a policy decision for you to make. Right now, this policy is drafted to essentially comply to conform to the general policy set forth in the ETS and what the administration is currently doing, which is vax or test. So if you wanted to go further, you could do so. That would be your policy, your chamber's policy.
It's just there, thousands of people in Vermont are now subject to proof and testing, not or testing, just because we all know that we can all spread it. And whether you're vaccinated or not, because we had, I believe the case here was somebody who was vaccinated on Monday, who was positive. At least that's the rumor I've heard. So I just am curious. I think we should discuss whether we want it to be and, or whether we want it to be or.
So Senator Clarkson, to that point, this is a draft policy for us to work off of, given what's happening nationally and what the administration is doing to give us a start. We've also started to do some work to see what sort of rapid testing that we could do for the building, and that's in the works to understand capacity. So just a footnote there, we'll keep on going, and then we can open it up for discussion after we get.
Okay.
All right, so we are at the bottom of page 3 in regard to those test results. What would happen with those test results? So the Office of the Sergeant at Arms would be required to send each individual by legislative email notice of their individual's test results, in addition to any in-person notification. This is currently provided, so it'd be sort of like a consistent method of alerting the person of their test results, and shall submit all test results to the Office of Legislative Human Resources as soon as practical on the day a result is received. An individual who tests positive for COVID shall not enter any legislative meeting spaces until it can be demonstrated that the individual is safe to return to those spaces in accordance with either CDC or Department of Health guidelines or other policies that may apply to the individual, an employee policy that will apply to legislative staff. On page 4, in subdivision 4, it states explicitly that optional testing is encouraged. So it's required for those who have not provided full proof of vaccination, but legislators and legislative staff who have demonstrated that they are fully vaccinated against COVID-19 are encouraged to be tested for COVID-19, regardless of their vaccination status. And those individuals shall be afforded the same opportunity to be tested for COVID-19 as are the legislators and staff who are required to be tested under this policy. Now, on page 4 in subsection D, it gets into how these records that are provided to the Human Resources Office would be maintained, and it overall addresses confidentiality. In D1, the Office of Legislative Human Resources would be required to maintain all records submitted to it in a secure location. And that office shall also maintain a roster of the legislators and staff who have demonstrated that they are fully vaccinated, and of those who are required to be tested under this policy, and shall provide the roster of the individuals required to be tested and notify any positive tests to this following list of people that is based on the person's position. Right now, this language provides that the roster of people who are required to be tested and notice of any positive tests would be provided to these entities. So these specified entities would essentially be providing oversight that the person's in compliance with this policy. So right now, this language provides that this information would be provided to the chair of the Chamber's Rules Committee in the case of a member of that chamber or that chamber's staff, or to the vice chair of the Rules Committee in the case of the committee chair, the chair of the appropriate oversight committee in the case of a department head, or the head of the appropriate legislative department in the case of any other legislative staff member. So these entities listed here would be ensuring that people who are required to be tested are getting tested weekly like they're supposed to. And if they do test positive, that they're not in the building.
Representative McCoy.
Is there any HIPAA violation here?
And turn back to Legislative Council. I believe the general principles are consistent with what is required. Yay, our Director and Chief Counsel, who is also an expert in healthcare policy.
That's right.
Yes.
All right, we ride the heavy area.
So you.
Congratulations, Jen.
Harvey, Director and Chief Counsel, Office of Legislative Counsel. So the short answer is that HIPAA does not apply. The HIPAA applies to covered entities, and covered entities are generally healthcare providers, or in the state of Vermont's case, the Agency of Human Services has opted to be treated as a covered entity. The legislature and the legislative branch is not a covered entity, so that is not a consideration.
Thank you.
Great.
Great.
Thank you.
So mic drop.
Jen, I'm sorry. Do you mind? We have another question.
So if HIPAA doesn't apply, then can we mandate people to get the vaccine, I guess, coming back, getting weekly testing coming back to Allison's question?
For Jen, or- I'm sorry.
I think it's unrelated.
So can we, if HIPAA's not applying, then if we're outside the purview of any other entity, can we mandate somebody who's been fully vaccinated to take a weekly test?
I think so. You can make that policy decision. Yes, just like you would be making this policy decision.
All right, any other questions? We should keep on going. Keep on going.
All right, so we're at the top of page 5 now. So this information goes on to say that the entity receiving the roster of individuals required to be tested and notice of those positive tests shall ensure the individual's compliance with this policy. And essentially making sure that they're testing weekly and that they're not in the building if they test positive. And any individual receiving information under this policy shall keep confidential any personally identifying information except to the extent necessary to implement this policy. But I believe it's consistent with some of the confidentiality protections that are required under federal employment law, OSHA, and the ADA.
Right. So both OSHA and the Occupational Safety and Health Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act require us to keep employee medical records confidential. They do not prevent us from requesting vaccination status or testing records because of the potential risk to other people in the building. So we're allowed to request that information, but we're required to keep anything we collect confidential, and it can only be shared to the extent necessary to, for example, identify close contacts and then notify them that they need to test. But something that might be an example would be if there was one person in a committee room who tested positive, you would notify all members of the committee saying someone in the committee room tested positive. We're requesting that all of you go get a test. And these are the guidelines. And then Chief Romei or the appropriate person would do the contacting there to kind of let people know, hey, you might need to quarantine, you might need to get a test, and what the next steps are. But in general, the identification of the individual would be very limited to those who absolutely need to know. And then otherwise, you're just letting out as much information as is necessary to control the spread and potentially get people pointed in the right direction as far as testing and quarantine goes.
Thank you. Question?
All right, so we're almost at the end. We're on page 5 in the last subsection E. This is about implementing this policy. Subdivision 1 would say that the Committee on Joint Rules recommends this policy as a matter of common concern to both chambers. That's language from your joint rules itself that describes the general jurisdiction of this committee, matters of common concern to both chambers. And the implementation language currently provides that each chamber shall be responsible for implementing this policy for the members of its chamber and its chamber staff. And the JLMC shall be responsible for implementing this policy for all other legislative staff. 2B is making explicit that this policy is in addition to the requirements of the legislative face mask policy. And the effective date right now is written as Monday, January 3rd, which is the first day before your first day of session. And it would remain in effect until the date determined by the implementing entity described in that subdivision 2.
Questions on that last part around implementation? Any other questions for Betsy Ann before we open it up for general discussion? Clarifying questions? Oh, okay, thank you, Betsy Ann. All right, let's open it up for discussion. Would it be helpful to hear from the Sergeant at Arms about some of the ideas around, that might also be helpful to give a little bit more context? That, can you do that? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Janet.
So, hello, Janet Miller, Sergeant at Arms.
Chief Romy and we have been looking at some alternatives of how we would do, what would we provide a place for testing. In this conversation, I am a little bit concerned about how much will be put on my staff as far as being able to administer everything. And I'm not sure I can do it with the present staff that we have. Chief, I know, has been looking at some other types of rapid testing that might require another entity would be less expensive. Am I right in saying that, Chief? Would you?
It's a different pathway to the same results.
Yes.
And it takes the cost per test from like $28 to $10.
So that is an option, but that might take an additional person as well.
Okay.
So I just want you to keep that in mind if you are thinking about it going in this direction, not that. And I would ask Damien, the chief counsel, if we hired another administrative staff, we would still be okay with that, with providing the information to legislators if someone was positive, because we're not following any HIPAA. So how many people can be involved with knowing this information?
So there isn't a specific limit on the number of people. It has to go through basically a process that's designed to preserve confidentiality to the extent possible. But obviously the people who are communicating or figuring out who needs to be contacted are going to know identifying information. But they're going to need to keep that confidential. So if for example, someone was brought on to sort of administer collecting test results and doing notifications, that person would have to keep the information confidential. The permanent records would be kept in a secure place at the Human Resources Office. And I believe the policy was drafted that way so that all the records are in one place. And that way you don't have issues with records being dispersed. And then that way you have just an easier way of keeping things secure and controlled. So again, this could be someone who kind of works out of that area and is able to control it. But very often in a regular business, you may have the individual supervisor and the human resources team and possibly supervisors from other offices where they had contact who now know at least some of the information. And it's going to just vary on the situation. But the goal is to minimize letting any unnecessary information out so that you're preserving people's confidentiality to the greatest extent possible.
Thank you. And my other, we would probably be doing the testing off premises in one of our other legislative spaces because we don't have space to do it here within the state house.
Janet, one of the concerns that was raised was around privacy. And so using the space at either 2 or 4 Aiken, which is primarily open, some of it's still being worked on, but we do have space available where we could do little, rooms here and there, or some.
Yes, I'm hoping, 2 Aiken is becoming a little bit of a challenge with getting some of the work exactly finished by the 15th. We're working towards as much as we can. We do have 4 Aiken, and I think that's considered a spot. Accessibility would be good to that space, but people might just have to go there.
Yep. Thank you. That's helpful. All right. Any questions for Janet? Okay. So going back to discussion on this draft, we heard from Senator Clarkson about the attestation. Are there other parts of this that you would like more information or discussion on? Senator Clarkson.
I think I'd like to explore as you know, and testing, not or testing. And the other, I think we're just going to have to be flexible, just given what's happening in the world. I urge us to really put on our flexible hats because we're going to have to pivot. We may have to pivot. And I would encourage us to. So I think in some ways it would be great to have a couple plans. This is a plan for if things are continuing to improve. I mean, this is a plan for our trying to get back together again if things are continuing to improve. If things begin to fall apart again, we happily, and I guess one of my questions, and I don't know if we will deal with that in joint rules or where we're going to deal with it, is what is the trigger for the decision to pivot to remote?
Yep.
So this is a great plan for if we're continuing to progress.
Yep.
It's not such a great plan if, if things begin to deteriorate again. And what would the trigger for that be? And that's just a question.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I'll say that the next agenda item over 2022 legislative session reopening plan, that is a question around what the trigger is. So we'll
Okay,
go
sorry.
there, but
See that? I mean, I guess.
that's okay. It's left general on purpose because I want to have
Yeah.
space to put all questions or thoughts on the table. But regarding mandated testing, or just to be clear on what you're asking for, are you recommending that it's mandatory rapid testing?
All these other institutions require that everybody be tested once a week.
So PCR.
So they all do PCR. They have a schedule. I mean, I know many of these institutions and they have a schedule. You have a set time when you go in and get tested. And they have many more employees than we do, and they handle it now seamlessly. So this is not, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's happening everywhere else. So and the only other question I have is, and maybe we discussed this briefly in terms of committees, but if there's a positive test, what is our contact tracing policy going to be? Do we want to set a policy around that, or are we just going to somehow deal with it?
All right, I'm putting that in the parking lot for our next agenda item.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Sorry to be.
Trying to find a way to methodically work through all of these really important questions. So thank you for that. Representative McCoy.
Do we know what the judiciary and executive branch's policy is regarding if somebody's vaccinated, if they are required to do a weekly test or not?
I am looking to
They're not.
Amy, the chief is.
They're not.
Chief
They are not.
Ermiai is.
They have gone to a suggested masking indoors now. That's new, I think. This week. And they're not requiring testing.
Unless you're not vaccinated. Correct. Okay.
Even given the ability for those vaccinated to carry the disease and or get it.
So the PCR tests that are provided for those who are not vaccinated, it's anyone is welcome. They don't check you, oh no, you're vaccinated, you can't have one. They don't do that. Anybody who wants to come by and get one, they come by and get one, they get us the box. So it's all of them.
Well, we're concerned about sort of shaming in other areas of the policy that we've talked about. It would be, that's the one plus of saying and, is that everybody just gets tested. There's no outing anybody. Anyway, it's just something for us.
Yes, it is.
Exactly. No, and that's another plus for doing that.
Yeah.
That's too much.
All right. So we're hearing thoughts. So what I hope we can get from this discussion are just the areas of places where people have recommended changes or want to have more discussion. I also know that this document has only been out for less than 24 hours. So I want to make sure that members and leaders have time to talk with their caucuses about this. So again, at our next meeting, we'll be coming back to this with the goal of having joint consensus. And then this, just like the other policy, as a reminder, has to go back to House rules and Senate rules. So with that, are there other places here to flag?
I just have one more
Yeah, go
question
ahead.
on that. Do we know how many people were talking about having weekly testing? I mean, I know we have 180 legislators, but the staff plus legislative staff.
Anyone have the
Do we have
total?
a sense?
Arlene,
Arlene must.
do you know?
For staff.
Yeah.
Including seasonal staff, we have just a little over 100, about 105 or so.
2H.
So we're talking about 280 people on a Tuesday morning, or well, maybe not. Staff will come in on Monday.
Right, and some committees
Possibly.
meet on Monday too.
So, yeah, I'm just wondering logistic wise,
Sure.
before the committee meets at 8 a.m. on Tuesday,
Yeah, they,
how are we gonna get everybody flowing through there?
Dartmouth schedule, it, you know, they can't possibly do the thousands of people in that day. They wrote, there's a whole schedule. Everybody's on their own individual schedule, but it's once a week.
Oh, so they don't necessarily have to, because does this policy say Tuesday?
It says
So
first day.
it's test on Friday, Friday, so that you know Tuesday.
Or the beginning of the following week. So that those results are available at the beginning of the following week.
Friday.
Which would be Monday,
Or Tuesday.
yeah, or Tuesday. So I'm just concerned about the logistic wise of.
Yeah, I mean,
and getting-
all these
Right.
other institutions just do it
As
as a
opposed
schedule.
to there, I don't know how many people are not vaccinated.
Right.
We don't know that, so.
I think whatever we decide on, we will have to be very thoughtful about a schedule.
Yeah.
Because of limited space. I think that should just go without saying at this point
Given,
that we'll have to do that. Chief
Would
Roman?
it help if I walked you through some of the logistics?
Sure.
That we've already, the problems we've already solved.
I love the positive framing. That's great.
I don't fit in the regular chairs. It's accommodation.
Thank you.
Matthew Romiak, Capitol Police. Two branches of testing for you, or really three branches of testing. The PCR tests, basically we scoped for Aiken, which when you walk across the little metal pathway down there, like you're going to HR, that front office there as a potential spot to set up some computers and cubicles, and there's a little private office that's unused at the moment to provide privacy should someone want to go in and deal with their test. The way the testing process works that that the executive branch is using, you go by a place, you grab a little test kit, you can, if you wanted to, take it to your committee room and sit right down in front of your iPad. You have a couple little things to put in the computer. You have to scan the little QR code so that it links your test up with you. The whole 9 yards, you swab your nose just like you do on every other PCR test. You seal it up in a little bag, you drop it off in a box in our office. We ship it out once a day UPS. We don't, nothing on the outside of the bag to connect you to the test. It's all done, part of your computerized process in the back. If you want privacy to do it, we'll have some space in Fort Baldwin. We have space in 109 State you could go to. I'm certain that you could find a committee room that may be underutilized at the moment and go in there and do it. I suspect that if you want to do testing on Thursday, PCR testing on Thursday, that we would probably, we'd have to figure out a cutoff time to make UPS, basically. And we just say, look, your test needs to be in by X o'clock, and we ship them out. Those results will come back to your email, probably Monday-ish, maybe as early as Sunday-ish. I suspect, I don't know, just you might have an email address or something, or work with IT to develop some automation stuff in the background to capture all the forwarded test results. And then we've got a little process outlined for folks to say, you know, hey, if you get a phone call that says you're positive, you need to do these 4 or 5 things. And they're all, you know, courtesy of the Vermont Department of Health. They have a very nicely laid out handout process to go through to notify your close contacts. We can help with that. We can notify committees. We can do a lot of things within that notification process to make those things work. Rapid testing, another branch of the puzzle. We have rapid tests as you experienced last Monday. We'll have those available. Anybody that wants one, just get one, go do your thing. If you need some help, we'll help you out. Well, by the policy, I guess we have to help you read it. Somebody from the Sergeant at Arms has to help you read it. We'll make that happen, whatever that looks like. I also suspect rapid testing will come in handy if we have a oh, wow, hell, listen, I just got an email, I'm positive. What do I do? Okay, so now we can take, the committees you're in, the people you were sitting at, hey, go test. We'll plug you right into the little VT alert that you all got last week and go, hey, you're a close contact. You need to come grab a test and check yourself. How you feeling? Do you have symptoms? Those kind of things. And then we can manage that positive cases against. So that's the PCR and the rapid and the outbreak mitigation. It's the first time you do one of these PCR tests sitting in front of your computer, it might take you 20 minutes. After about the third week or fourth week, you'll be down to, you can do it in your sleep and you'll be done in 5 minutes going about your day. The rest of it's policy. That's all. We'll just make it happen. Questions?
Thanks, Chief. Any follow-up questions for the chief? All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. So with that, I'll just open it up before we move on to the next agenda item. Are there any other parts of this that you would like to flag and have more discussion on besides what we already named? Nope. Nope. Okay. All right, great. So again, just to reiterate, next steps on this, we will take this up at our next meeting. We'll get some more feedback from folks and we'll have a robust conversation that will hopefully lead us to a recommendation for both House and Senate rules to take up. Next, we have 2022 legislative session reopening plan. So again, thinking about the big picture and everything we want to cover. So we've talked about masks, we've talked about testing, we've talked about live stream, we've voted on room capacity limits. Now it's what have we not talked about yet that we need to discuss? And what other questions do we have that we would want to hear testimony on? So I think it is incredibly important for us to be making these decisions based on what the medical experts are recommending. I completely understand, and I know, there's a lot of tension to have a plan in place right now, but things are evolving and changing. So we want to be flexible, but also be clear about how we're coming back and what sort of triggers would be in place that would move us from being in person to online. I know that the Department of Health and the chief just talked about what would happen if there's a positive test, and we can get some more language and process within that draft. But what I want to open it up to a discussion here, or the questions that you would have to help figure out what the trigger would be. So I have right now, and we are taking notes, so we'll make sure that you get these, but are rapid tests equipped enough to tell us if a vaccinated person is carrying the virus if they're not showing? So are we confident in that test? Would we set a trigger around community spread or other markers to send us back to Zoom? Is there a trigger that's maybe relied on building spread? What else? We have to talk about how we're going to treat people coming into the building. That is another one. What are other points that we should add to my list that we just started?
Those are good. I think the blanket.
Oh, Representative McCoy, and then I'll go to Representative Miller of the Sergeant at Arms office.
And then probably gonna have the
Okay.
answer to my question.
Yeah.
We have all these, we're talking about all these policies regarding staff and legislative staff and legislators, but it's the people's house and we haven't yet discussed people just walking in the door.
Yeah.
Like they're just walking in.
Mhm.
So, if we have a policy in place that we're following, it doesn't mean a hill of beans if people are just walking in.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's a huge piece of this puzzle, I think.
Yeah. I mean, that is what makes us unique, right?
Yeah.
We have staff, we have elected officials, we have the public that are coming in, participating. Every day, it's a different set of people in this building. So yes, that is a topic that we absolutely have to take up. Is this policy the same policy that we use for people coming in the building? What does testing look like, et cetera? So that is definitely a next step that we need to take.
I do think that we've, with the video conferencing and people being allowed to, see us pretty much 24/7 on any time of day or night, they can just flip it on and watch us. That's a huge piece of this.
Yeah.
But I still think that we have to have, I mean, I know there's some state legislatures that don't allow the public in, right? Just don't allow them. And they have the video conferencing and that's it.
Yeah. So I think it will be helpful to get information. I think we started to collect this on what other states do for the public, just to give us a better sense of what's out there. Janet and then Representative McCarthy.
Just thank you. Just one thing I'd like to flag for you to think about is the cafeteria in general. As in some schools, they eat within their pod, within their classroom. At what point do we want to maybe instill that, or something to think about?
Yep. Thank you. Representative McCarthy.
I did get a question from one of our colleagues about to add to your list of trigger items, which is what happens when somebody is a positive case and has been in committee with others. Like, are we gonna have a specific set of policies for committees that have a positive test?
Yes. Yeah. I think that's what the chief was just walking through around the emergency system. But we do then also have to say at what point is that committee, going to Zoom? Right. Yeah.
So Mike, each chamber, if that, we have an easy pivot to going remote, obviously. However, we'd also have to put into place with our various chambers, the ability to vote. If we pivoted, we'd have to have an allowance to be able to vote in committee too. I mean, so there are a couple of things we have to figure out, which aren't difficult. We would have to do that. But luckily, we're able to do it, I think, a little more easily than schools.
Have a lot of practice.
Yep.
But yes, those are the next steps in our decision-making process here of the triggers. And then what does it look like? Is it the whole committee's on Zoom for for 1 week? Like the medical advice says 1 week, then, is that when we go remote for them for 1 week? Obviously, if they're doing the whole thing remote, we would want to talk about whether they could vote or not. And so those are all good questions that come from that scenario. Yes. Go ahead.
So on contact, so on the test, if a positive test occurs, who is notified of the positive test in addition to the individual? Is Matt notified or Arlene? I mean, because obviously there would need to be more than just that. I mean, not that we don't fully trust that individual to share that, but who do they immediately share it with? And we'd have to develop protocol for if they get a yes test, who do they call right away? Or does the yes test go to two people, the individual and Arlene?
Yeah, so it's different for staff and for members, but Betsy Ann, do you want to?
I'm sorry, did I miss that?
Oh, it's okay. It's partially addressed at the bottom of page 4.
Oh, sorry.
High level overview, the Office of Legislative Resources would know that information, the Office of the Sergeant at Arms would know that information, and then Human Resources would provide that information also to the entity, essentially with supervision over that individual as best described this policy initial draft does. So it'd be the chair of the chamber's rules committee in the case of a member of that chamber or that chamber staff, or if it's the chair, it'd be the vice chair of that committee. And the chair of the appropriate oversight committee in the case of the department head, which would be JLMC for most of our legislative departments. And then the head of the appropriate legislative department in case of any other legislative staff.
Senator Clarkson, do you have any clarifying questions on that? Do you see it?
I see it. two, A, B, and C, right?
Correct. Bottom page.
So, I mean, that's putting a lot on the chair of the committee. I mean, it's,
Well, the chair would be
I guess
the
that's,
speaker in the House and the pro tem, right, in the Senate?
oh, I see what you
Yes,
Chair of the rules
yeah,
in each respective chamber, so.
mean. Yeah, sorry.
role that we're currently playing
Yeah, right.
every day. All right. Okay, other questions to add to this? I'm just gonna go around. Chief, go ahead.
One thing I might recommend is a contact log for committees. So it would, in my opinion, it would be up to the person coming to the committee, the member of the public coming to the committee. I'm coming to Senator Brock's committee, I might decide to look with my name and my phone number for that day if I want to be notified if I'm a close contact. I think this is to your point, Senator Clarkson, about what happens if you have a positive test or you have a positive in the committee. How are we going to do that contact tracing? And for the staff and members, it's pretty easy, but capturing members of the public or say executive branch state employees, judicial branch state employees that are not part of the regular bubble, we would need some law that says, hey, I was there.
Right. And we have our committee assistants who in COVID have kept incredibly good track of all the witnesses. And anyone who, and that is already exists and we could amplify and build on that if I think, I mean, that makes sense. And hopefully, you know, we'll have,
Yeah, so just following up on that, right now, we know everyone who's in this room, we would remember, but when we come back in January, it's gonna be different people for different topics, and it's not gonna be as clear or easy, so that is a good point. Thank you, Chief. Any other questions for the list? Yeah, go ahead, Peggy.
I'm sure you've already thought about it, but if a staff member or legislator gets up in the morning and has COVID symptoms, what would be the protocol for them to come back to work?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Any other? Okay.
I guess I would love to know what other states do, because there's a third group of people. And the third group of people are the people who've had COVID. They have to have it confirmed by a doctor, you know, because that makes them immune to a certain degree. And so do other states let that be a third category of people who have basically confirmed COVID cases, I would say, who've had it, done with it, and as a result have a lot of immunity. And do the other states treat them as a separate group, or should we not?
So, yeah, just quickly looking at the initial overview that the clerk pulled together, I'm just looking quickly through to see if there's something specific to those who have tested positive. They're more general, Senator Clarkson, we can investigate more, but these are more about limiting access to.
It's about regulation.
Yeah.
Sorry, everybody's telling me I've missed it somewhere.
It's okay.
It's just one of the documents.
All right, so.
Oh, other state, okay, great.
So what I'm not seeing any other hands. What I'd like to do then is if you think of another question in the next couple of days, please reach out, let me know, let the clerk know, and we'll work to get some medical experts, maybe someone from the Department of Health to help us answer these questions at our next committee hearing. And then also it would be great we'll send this out to get feedback from members and others as well.
Yeah.
All right, so that wraps up that part of our agenda. The last part is around legislative security. So I've heard from several members about their concerns about security in the building, given some of the security incidents that we've had. And so I wanted to hold space to get an update from the Sergeant at Arms and from the Capitol Police about the current status of our security in the building, and if they have any initial recommendations or strategies that we should consider as we plan on how we come back to the building. So can I see Janet for 1 second?
Can we stretch? I'm stretching.
That's the end, you superstar. You too, Damien.
Anybody missing a red pen?
Those red.
No, it's definitely not my pen.
Crazy. It's not necessary.